Hello everybody, welcome to this video where I'm going to be talking about a couple of old ideas, but I'm trying to give these old ideas like some refreshing, and I want to kind of stop saying this in my videos where I feel like I'm going to be repeating some stuff that I've already talked about, at least content or idea wise. So I was reading Yes, this book by Robert Cialdini, I think that's how you pronounce his name, basically on how to persuade people, right? And in this book, I'm basically at the end of it, and it's talking about the difference between individualistic societies and collectivistic societies. Now, individualistic societies are like the United States, and I could pretty much say only like the United States or maybe European, but even the Europeans, when you really analyze their culture, they're more they're kind of traditional, right? The Europeans, and I would say like the rest of the world, right? Like just notice the imperial system versus the metric system. Like the whole world uses the metric system and the US uses the imperial system, things like that. But culturally, the United States focuses, or the people from the United States focus on the individual, right? The individual rights, the individual lifestyle, the individual way of living, the individual liberties, right? It's more like me, and me, right? And personally, I like that. I mean, I think both collectivistic and individualistic have pros and cons. Too much of one can be bad, but collectivistic societies are like, think like India, Latin America, they say Southeast Asia. I would even say like Russia, where it's all about the group, right? It's like the group is first. And I will even sacrifice, not like Aztec hard sacrifice, but like I will even sacrifice my time, my money, my resources. I will be uncomfortable for the group, right? And individualistic societies don't really do that. I mean, I think even in Europe there are some more collectivistic than individualistic. Like I think Spanish people are more collectivistic than say like English people, things like that. But anyway, these ideas are old, but I'm going to try to correlate other concepts with these ideas, other known concepts too. So the first idea is that individualistic societies, and this is from the book, Yes, individualistic societies like in the United States, when communicating, are more focused on information than relation or relationship, right? What this means is that if I communicate with you and I have an individualistic tendency, I want to know what, who, when, where, why, and that's it, right? I want to know like the objective information that I need in order for me to do my job or whatever, right? Let's say we're talking business or even like in personal. Let's say I'm well, that's kind of a bad example. Like I'm trying to figure out what time to meet up with my friends, right? And it's like when, where, who's gonna be there, etc. But when we get together, we'll like joke around and whatever. But okay, the tendency in this case, their tendencies, right? The propensity for you to be more inclined towards one or the other. If you're in an individualistic society, you tend to focus more on information. And if you are from a collectivistic society, you tend to focus more on the relationship, right? So this could be like small talk, right? Like people will engage in small talk, or maybe I want to know how your day is going, or I want to know what you've been up to. And this could sometimes come off as nosy, right? But I think it's also good chatter, right? And a lot of people don't like to do this. I would even say, like, the younger you are, the more individualistic you are, right? Just think of a young person or a teenager that's like, get off my grills, like I don't want to talk. And an older person that's more community oriented, right? That is more willing, or who is more willing to engage in small talk, vague talk that doesn't lead anywhere, like you telling me about your family, that's not, well, sure, it's information, but that's not going to lead anything, right? It's not instrumental, but it does foster the relationship, right? It makes it so that you and I get along better, right? It's like, oh, okay, now you told me about your family, now I know a little bit more about you, etc., right? So individualistic societies always focus more on information in communication and how the group affects me. This is key because, as opposed to collectivistic societies, they focus on how they affect the group, right? And this is key because if you're in an individualistic society and you move to a collectivistic society, right, you have that mindset of like, I'm coming from an individualistic society, which is focused on information more than relation, and I'm focused on how you guys affect me, right? You're not letting me do my job, or you're interfering, or you're being good and you're letting me do my job, etc., right? As opposed to how the collective is thinking, how can I make people's lives better? Where the individual or the individualistic society person is thinking like, how can the collective make my life easier, right? Which I thought was kind of like an interesting contrast. The collectivistic society focus on relationships in communication and how I affect the group, right? So I thought that was a little bit interesting, that difference. Now, the example for the collectivistic society that Robert uses in his book is the Japanese culture. Now, the Japanese culture is very interesting because, I have this idea of collectivistic societies being like very, not lazy, but like inefficient, unproductive, right? Just think of like Latin America or like Southeast Asia, or like, like where the first world countries are, right? Like Europe, the United States, those countries, they're more individualistic compared to these other collectivistic, because I think the bad thing about collectivistic is that, you kind of get into that group mentality, and you kind of feel like you don't really have to work as much, because it doesn't depend on you. You're not responsible in a collectivistic society. The group is responsible, right? So if something doesn't get done, you're going to share the responsibility. You're going to share the blame, so it's not as impactful for you. But if you live in an individualistic society, if something doesn't get done, it's 100% your fault, right? So your responsibility is also 100%. So I feel like that gives way for people to be like, I don't really have to do it, right? In collectivistic societies. And so nothing gets done ultimately, right? Now that's a very biased idea, I know. It's kind of like a prejudice. But anyway, that's why this idea contrasts with my idea, with my prejudice, because they say the Japanese are very collectivistic, right? So they're not individualistic like in the United States. And the Japanese are very collectivistic. Not only are they collectivistic, but they're disciplined, and they're very efficient, and they're very productive, to the point that, like, just like Germany after World War II, now they're like a superpower, right? And in part is because they're an island, kind of like England, so they have to work hard, right? And I asked ChatGPT, like, what's the difference between like the collectivistic societies in Latin America and the collectivistic society in Japan? And they say, well, the collectivistic societies like in Mexico or Latin America focus more on like family, and on like sticking together and being there for each other and empathy and things like that. Whereas like the Japanese collectivistic society focuses more on efficiency, education, the future, getting things done as a group. So I think that's a very, it's like a balance, because you have the efficiency of like the American culture, the United States culture, but you also have that like the value system, the empathy, the family orientation of like the Latin American countries, right? So the Japanese, I guess, as a society, maybe have figured out like the perfect balance between both, even though they're considered a collectivistic society. And this, they say that they see it in the way that they provide feedback. Now, feedback is very important, because feedback can be something as simple as nodding your head when someone is talking. So you do this, as you listen, you can say, uh-huh, you can say, yes, I see, oh, I understand, oh, really, right? You egg someone on to keep talking. And this is done to provide feedback, right? To see, that doesn't have a purpose. So when you do the head nodding, or it's not really so you can exchange information. I mean, it does have the purpose to let the other person know that you're listening, but it's more emotional, right? Like the other person will feel they're being heard, and then they'll continue talking, right? They'll feel heard. They'll feel like they're really interacting with someone, right? It's part of the interaction. And I do this, even though I consider myself individualistic in my communication and in my relationships, and also in how I view the group. Like, it's like, what can the group do for me? Not how can I make the group like more comfortable. It's how can the group make me more comfortable. I think there's two orientations, right? There's a bi-directional here orientation, where one of them is listening, right? One comes towards, the message, receiving the message in communication, and one is speaking. So one is listening, one is speaking. When I listen, I think I'm more collectivistic. Like, I'll actually hear you, I'll give you that feedback, I'll nod, I'll say yes, and when I speak, I think I'm more individualistic, right? It's kind of like, and I know there's a problem in communication, because many people feel like when someone speaks with strength, other people may feel like that person is, in the wrong for exaggerating, right? But it's not really my intention that I'm saying, I can come across as maybe tyrannical in my speech, but that's just how I talk, right? Like, ultimately, I'm open for discussion, I'm open for debate. My intention isn't to come across as tyrannical or controlling, or like, this is it, dogmatic and no questions asked. No, like, challenge me, like, ask me, are you sure, or I think this other, propose other things, but my speech is like that. My speech is confident, it's powerful, right? So many people see that as like a bad way of communicating, because they say you should speak less forceful, right? Like, and even say things like, I could be wrong, but what do you think? And I don't do that. I say my piece, and you give me your piece, right? But a lot of people don't talk like that. So I could come across as individualistic when I speak, but I think collectivistically, I do listen, right? Or let me say that again. I think when I speak individualistically, but when I listen collectivistically, right? Now, something that's very interesting for me here is that people don't provide feedback. This is crazy, because like even in text messages, right? Like, I was just recently asking for information about a job, and I said, they're like, yeah, good morning, like, what are you looking for? What type of vacancy are you looking for? And I explained to them, and then they were just literally like, what state are you in, right? And I told them, and then they just didn't answer. So I was like, what state am I? They weren't even like, and it's so simple, like something like, okay, thank you, or I see, or oh, like just any type of feedback to what you just said. And no, they just hit me back with a question like, what's the, like, so, and people are like that whenever you're in like a service type of business, like, you'll walk in and you'll be like, hey, can I get this, or do you guys have this medicine or whatever? And they'll just look at it, and they won't even say anything. They'll just go in the back and get it, and it's like, whoa, assholes. Like, can you give me some feedback? Can you at least say like, oh, sure, or just a moment, or nothing? It's just like, no feedback, absolutely, and that's the part that I see as troublesome. So what happens also when people don't provide feedback? Like, let's say you're talking to your friend and you're telling them about something that happened, and instead of your friend saying, oh, I see, or oh, really, or like nodding, or I understand, they're just sitting there looking at you like this with a blank face. You're gonna feel like they're judging you, right? They seem, at least even if they're not judging you, they seem judgmental. If they're not giving you feedback, they look like assholes, basically, right? So people that don't give you feedback in communication, in interactions over a text message. Text messages aren't complicated. You know, people a lot of times say it's just that you don't know the tone of the message. No, they're not complicated. You know, just act like you would if you're speaking. You know, and if you don't act like that, then you're an asshole, because that's not how you act either in real life, you know, when you're speaking. So if you hear someone and you just, you know, go and do whatever, and you don't even tell them like what you're gonna do, you know, or give them any sort of feedback, you're being an asshole. You know, there's no other word. You know, you're being you're being a butthole. So people that don't provide feedback seem judgmental, or at least they leave interpretation from the other side, from the person that's on the other end, on the receiving end. They leave interpretation in limbo, up in the air, right? It's like, you know, like I asked myself, like, did I do something wrong? You know, like I gave the information to this person that was requesting what vacancy, right, over the text message. And then when they just asked me like what state without any sort of feedback, you feel like you did something wrong too, right? You're like, well, maybe I shouldn't have said this, but there's no feedback. That's miscommunication. Miscommunication is not a quality issue, right? It's not like what words you use or what words you don't use. It's not saying things, right? So if you don't say anything, if you don't give people feedback, if you don't communicate, then there's miscommunication, right? It's that simple. So a lot of service asshole people do this, I've seen. And you know, you can say, well, it's just, you know, their job sucks. They've been working 10 hours. They haven't had breakfast. You know, they haven't had their coffee. I don't care, you know, like, then don't be working. Go home or get some coffee, or wake up early, or get breakfast, like whatever, you know, like, or figure out your shit. Leave your shit at the door, right? That's basically what it comes down to, right? I'm not your psychologist or your mommy to be dealing with your emotional issues. You know, I want a service, and I came here to get a certain type of service, right? And I'm not getting it. That's basically like my issue there. Okay, now the last thing I wanted to talk about is also very known ideas: intrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, which I recently saw this with my students, is very interesting, because intrinsic motivation deals with doing things because you like them, right? Excuse me, I was just recently thinking, like, what happens if you really like something but you're bad at it? Right? Like, let's say you really like playing the guitar, or you really like playing chess, but you suck at it, you're bad at it, but you do it a lot, but you're not good at it. You know, then it becomes a hobby, but you can't make any money off it, right? See, that's the problem with the idea of like, oh, just find something you love to do and you will never work a day in your life. It's like, no, what happens if you like to do this? What happens if I really like playing basketball, but I suck at basketball, right? Just completely, like, I'm not good at it, but I love it. You know, then it's just a hobby, right? Okay, but anyway, extrinsic motivation, it's like this whole pedagogical idea, because with students, you want them to do things because they like to do them, which is really hard to do. Typically, you need to either reward or punish, right? Punish more often than not. It's like, if you don't study, if you don't pass your exams, then you won't get a good grade, then you will have to repeat the subject, whatever, right? So extrinsic motivation deals with the external factors, right? Like, you know, I'll give you a piece of candy if you do this, or I'll give you money, or like everyone works for money, so that's an intrinsic motivation. But the people that work not only for money, but because they like their job, that's intrinsic motivation, right? So it's like, you got to find that intrinsic part, right? Especially for things you have to do. Like, it's like I have to do this. So, you know, because of this XYZ intrinsic motivators, money, whatever, a good grade, but I'm going to find reasons that I like to do this, right? To motivate myself internally, right? So I'm going to mix this with the ideas of introverts and extroverts. Introverts, we know, are people that like to be alone, right? They don't like to be around many people. You know, they rather be alone with their thoughts, reflective. And extroverted people are people that like to socialize, that like to mingle, that like to have a lot of friends, right? That like to go out a lot, maybe to be around a lot of people, right? So introverts are like, I think introverts are more motivated by intrinsic things, right? So like ideology, they say is a big one, right? So if you're trying to motivate someone to do something, right? Like, hey, we need to do a protest regarding these issues or whatever. If the people there are introverts, they're more likely to be motivated by intrinsic factors like ideology. Like I'm thinking the Nazis, like the first Nazis, they were probably ideologically driven, and I think they were introverts, right? They weren't really social. They were outcasts ultimately. So yeah, that they are motivated by intrinsic factors, right? By intrinsic like rewards, or by intrinsic ideals, right? And extroverts are more often than not, I believe, motivated by external factors, right? Now, what are the external factors and the internal factors for introverts and extroverts? What are these factors that motivate these people? Well, introverts are motivated by ideas, right? Like I was saying, they're ideologically driven because they think a lot, right? They reflect a lot because they're alone a lot, right? They're not discussing ideas, so they have their own criteria, their own ideas, and if you tap into that, then that's going to motivate them. As opposed to extroverts who are motivated by people and things, right? So like a nice car, friends, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, right? So they're motivated by people, external, and things, right? And I dare say feelings, right? Now there's a correlation between feelings, emotions, and also people, right? Because you would assume that the introverts are actually the emotional ones, the feely types, but it's actually the extroverts that are driven by emotion, right? Because emotion is a mess, right? It's like, I feel this, I feel that, now I'm here, now I'm that, now I'm talking to John, now I'm talking to Paul, Mary, whatever, and you're just kind of like all over the place, right? Emotionally too. And logically, ideally driven, right? Ideologically driven is the introvert, right? Well, that's kind of like how I see it. Now I could be wrong in this case. So I'm gonna circle back to the idea of collectivistic societies and say that maybe this also has to do with the idea of individualistic versus collectivistic societies. Now, individualistic societies, you could say, tend to be more introverted, right? They tend to be more ideologically driven, right? They have their own criteria. They don't depend on the group, right? And that's what motivates them. What motivates them ultimately are the ideas, right? As opposed to collectivistic societies that are constantly interacting with people that are feely type and that basically are motivated by external factors. They're not going to go to work because they like their job, because they rather be at home with their family, with their friends, with interacting socially. They're going to go to work for extroverted reasons, right? Like money, things, right? A new car, whatever, right? Feelings also, right? If I'm at work and I'm feeling good, I want to be having a good time, talking to the people there, whatever, right? Like I don't want to be bored doing work that I don't really care about, right? Etc. And the last thing I wanted to discuss is also the idea of clothes. Now, I've noticed in my life, whenever I start hanging out with new people, my clothes tend to change, right? They haven't in the last couple of years, but when I have done this, like, when I integrate myself into new groups of people, my clothes change. And I think that's also a very important part of this extroverted ideology, right? Where you're basically, in order to fit into a new group of people, even ideologically driven, because all these kind of things overlap ultimately. Introverts are also motivated by external things, and in this case, extroverts also have a certain ideology that they need to follow. So it's like, if you're coming into my group, you have to start dressing like us. You have to wear my clothes. I'll teach you. Like, here's a shirt, here are some pants, here are some shoes, here, and they'll give you these things to kind of try to make you like them, right? Because you're following like a new group. So yeah, that's interesting how people also start to change their wardrobe when they start to hang around new people. So I'm going to be making a video on cultural ritualism next, which is going to talk about all these things that we still do as in society that's kind of funny, that actually have to do with like superstition. But yeah, I just thought I'd talk about this, some ideas, kind of combining ideas here, like individualistic, collectivistic, introverts, extroverts, motivators, and feedback when you're communicating. So let me know what you think about all this, and I'll see you in the next one, all right? Peace.